When Emily was very young, she had a deep love for fairy tales. Each time she believed that these enchanting stories could become a reality in her own life. However, it turned out that dreams can come true in unexpected and frightening ways. First, her mother passed away, leaving young Emily feeling devastated. At that time, Emily couldn't accept the fact that her mother would no longer enter their home, prepare delicious breakfasts, or engage in playful pillow fights in their bed. The girl convinced herself that everyone around her was pretending, hiding the truth that her mother had merely fallen under the spell of an evil sorceress and was now trapped in a deep slumber within a fairy tale dream. Desperate for her mother's return, Emily pleaded with her father to wake her up. However, all her father could do was weep, and a year later, another woman entered their lives, Annabelle. "This is Annabelle," Emily's dad explained. "She will be your new mum." "No," Emily firmly replied, stepping back from the fake smile of her new woman. "I don't need a new mum." "Of course you do," her father insisted, grabbing Emily and pulling her closer. "Annabelle knows how to take care of kids. She's a teacher. I'm sure you two will become friends." "No way," Emily declared, resisting her father's grip. "We don't need her." For the first time in her life, Emily received a spanking from her father. Although it wasn't physically painful, it was deeply hurtful, and she spent the rest of the day alone in her room shedding tears. When hunger finally drove her out of her hiding place, Annabelle informed her that she would only receive food if she referred to her as mother. That evening, Emily went to bed hungry, sobbing uncontrollably. Contrary to her hopes, her father did not remove the wicked stepmother from their lives. In fact, she gradually became the dominant figure in their household. Their lives began to resemble the fairy tales of stepmothers and unfortunate stepdaughters, even to the extent that Emily's father fell ill. He suffered for a long time, his illness consuming him from within. 12-year-old Emily couldn't bear to see her father in that state, emaciated, pale, with a drip in his arm. "I won't live much longer," her father admitted one day, in a simple and matter-of-fact manner. "You see, my first wife is calling me to her. I thought I could cope, I could live without her, but it didn't work. I'm sorry, Annabelle, I guess I'm a one-woman man. Go on living, but I beg you, don't leave Emily." "I love you, of course I won't," the new wife assured him, holding his hand. But Emily sensed that it was all a lie. After her father's passing, Emily discovered that he had left all his money to her. Annabelle became her legal guardian. At first, she took the girl's funds with a cautious eye, and then, feeling complete impunity, she became increasingly reckless. Less than 6 months later, the widow found herself a new husband, a young, audacious man with the physique of a fitness trainer. Emily started isolating herself more and more in her room, avoiding hearing or seeing them. She would often wander around the city aimlessly. Although she excelled academically and maintained a tidy appearance, she never participated in any class activities. Most people assumed she was just naturally reserved, so no one questioned her further. However, the truth was that Emily had no money at all, not even an allowance. The girl patiently waited for the day when she could inherit her father's money and escape from the house that no longer felt like her own. Things took a turn for the worse when the stepmother suddenly began suspecting that her young husband was showing excessive attention to her young stepdaughter. She constantly monitored both of them, causing a frequent confrontation. On one occasion, she even threw a hot frying pan at Emily, who managed to shield herself with her hand, resulting in a burn mark. Emily's life turned into a nightmare. She would forever remember that day when her enraged stepmother grabbed her and threatened to throw her off the balcony from the 7th floor. Looking into the mad woman's burning, deranged eyes, Emily screamed and screamed until her stepmother's husband rushed out and restrained his wife. Emily gasped for air, rubbing her throat with her hands, but only hoarse sounds emerged. Little did she know that her voice had completely disappeared. That evening, huddled under her blanket, Emily overheard snippets of conversation through the wall. "What have you done?" her husband yelled. "Now she'll definitely go to the police and spill everything. You'll end up in jail, you fool, and then goodbye to your cushy life with orphan money. How stupid can you be to mess things up like this?" "That won't happen," the stepmother declared suddenly. "I'll take care of everything." "What else are you up to?" shouted the obviously frightened man. "Mind you, I didn't sign up for anything like that." "I know, because you're a coward," replied the stepmother coldly. "I'll take her out of sight, to my grandmother's village, to get some fresh air. And there, the places are remote, all sorts of people meet. Again, the river is deep near. Anything can happen." "I didn't hear that," said the man. Emily did not listen further. Her ears were noisy. Her heart was beating like crazy. What to do? Go to the police? Just like that? Without a voice? She wouldn't even be able to explain what happened. Well, she will write a statement, and stepmother will say that this is all a lie, written to incriminate an honest woman. But she's going to take her to the middle of nowhere and drown her there. Something must be done. In the morning, the stepmother ordered Emily to pack. The girl's voice never came back, so she couldn't even call for help. Emily was getting more and more scared by the minute. "I'll run away on the road," she decided to herself. Her stepmother drove her out of town, and they drove for a long time through completely unfamiliar places. Emily had never been in these parts. Besides, there were few settlements along the way, only forests replaced by fields. The girl estimated that they had travelled for about 5 hours. The road had long ago become a country road, and then it dived into a dense thicket. Trees approached her from both sides, bending down, as if looking at her. Who decided to disturb their peace? Emily felt an unbearable urge to go to the restroom, and she mooed and tried to tell her stepmother. At first, the woman didn't pay attention to her, but then, realizing that the damned girl could ruin her seat, she stopped and forcibly dragged Emily out of the car. "Come on, what are you waiting for? There's no one here." She pointed the girl directly at the road, but she shook her head and nodded at the thick bushes. "Oh, how shy we are," said her stepmother with a sneer. "Okay, get into the bushes if you like, and I'm here in the car. Let's hurry up." Emily, making sure that the stepmother was waiting for her right on the road, climbed into the bushes. Here it is, a chance, flashed a crazy thought, and the girl ran as fast as she could right into the forest wilderness, tearing like a hunted deer between branches, bushes and trees. "You little brat!" screamed the stepmother, rushing after her. But time had been lost, and Emily had gotten a little head start. In addition, terror gave her speed, and she ran. The stepmother's voice became quieter and quieter, remained somewhere behind, and then the strength left her, and Emily collapsed face down in the soft moss. That's what saved her. By some miracle, she ran into the very centre of the swamp without falling into the mire by the islets that were firmly on the surface. A driftwood that had been accidentally knocked down on the run went to the bottom, and by the time the panting stepmother ran out to the place, the mire had just closed over her with a loud slurping sound. The stepmother gazed at the chain of footprints left by the fugitive, then shifted her gaze to the spot where something had gone underneath. Did she really drown herself? Good riddance to you, you little wretch. She spat into the grass, shivered angrily, and walked back towards the car. Emily didn't hear her words. She lost consciousness. She woke up from the fact that lying down was wet. The girl opened her eyes and almost screamed with horror. The mossy grass tubercle on which she was lying was slowly going down into the mire. Emily froze, afraid to move, and looked around. The lessons had taught her to grab onto a branch or lean on a stick, but there was neither here. She tried to crawl away. As it turned out, in vain, because she immediately fell into the mire. Emily moaned, floundering and kicking up the viscous mud with her hands. Suddenly, it seemed to her that some shadow on the other side of the swamp rushed towards her and crawled closer. 2 yellow eyes flashed. A wolf! Flashed through the girl's mind. She became so frightened that she stopped waving her arms and prepared to drown. But the shaggy shadow, moving purposefully and breathing noisily, was already near. Could it be a dog, after all? Emily hesitated. There was no time to ponder, and she clutched at the animal's fur. Feeling that the swamp was letting go, Emily wrapped her arms around her 4-legged helper's neck and began to crawl out of the mire. Both were panting from exertion, but their legs were already free. The girl released her hands, catching her breath. However, her saviour, whoever he was, growled and grasped her arm. Not painfully, but in a way that made her feel his fangs. Emily somehow understood what was expected of her and crawled after him, attempting to replicate the exact path. Occasionally, the beast glanced back as if checking if she was still there. The journey through the swamp seemed endless, and Emily could hardly believe it when she managed to grab hold of a branch and pull herself onto dry ground. She rolled onto her back and closed her eyes. Then she felt a rough tongue on her cheeks. Well, now he will eat me, with some indifference, thought the girl. She felt so sad that she did not want to live or move at all. And yet she raised her head and looked into the eyes of the beast. Somewhere she had heard or read that animals could not bear a direct human gaze. Apparently this beast had not read about the fact, for it looked at her directly and even, it seemed, reproachfully. And then he turned and went into the thicket, looking around. At first Emily didn't understand his intentions and felt a flicker of joy. Perhaps he had been satiated or found her unappetizing. There was a chance that the beast would leave and she could get up and go. But the beast, noticing that the girl remained still, growled irritably and returned. Emily flinched, and it seized her wet jacket's edges, dragging her behind him. Who cares? She thought. I'll follow him. Maybe he really does know the way to the humans, and isn't trying to lead me into his lair, and have me as canned food there at all. Her doubts vanished when, after half an hour of relentless struggle through the branches, they arrived at a clearing in the middle of the forest. There stood a hut that looked like it belonged to Hansel and Gretel, or so Emily thought. Even in critical situations, her love for fairy tales made itself known. The beast approached the dwelling and emitted a hoarse sound resembling a growl. "Wolfie, is that you?" came a voice from the hut. "Are you hungry, wanderer?" The door swung open, revealing a huge man in a camouflage suit. At least, that's how he appeared to the frightened girl. A woodsman or a hunter? Emily's thoughts scattered like frightened squirrels. "Who have you brought?" the bewildered man asked, scanning the trembling Emily. clearly shivering from the cold and fear. "Who are you?" He was indeed a little under 2 meters tall, so she could only look up at him, with her head raised. Emily pointed to her mouth and shook her head. "Are you mute?" the man exclaimed. Emily burst into tears, having already experienced more than enough shocks for one day. "Enough with the dampness, you're completely soaked," grumbled the man. "Come inside the hut. I have the dry clothes on the bench. Get out of those rags and change into them, and I'll take care of this shaggy dog." Trembling, Emily entered the warm hut, filled with the scent of herbs. She removed her wet clothes, found a warm shirt, wrapped it around herself like a dress and buttoned it up. The door creaked, and the man picked Emily's wet clothes up and carried her outside, giving another instruction. "Take the warm felt boots near the furnace. Don't shake like that. I don't eat little ones like you." Indeed, there was a small furnace in the hut that emitted enough heat. Emily found the felt boots and put them on, relishing the blissful warmth. Glancing out the window, she saw the man stroking her saviour and then throwing something into its bowl. From the depths of her heart, the girl hoped it wasn't the stew of some other lost girls after all. Surprisingly, as she warmed up, her fear dissipated. It seemed that she had reached the limit of fear, and now indifference had taken its place. But what else could happen? Well, they would think about it later, for now she was starving. After some thought, Emily went to the table and noticed a newspaper with a crossword puzzle and a pencil next to it. It seemed that the local hermit still had some connection with the outside world, since he was interested in the news. She took the pencil and wrote in the margins of the newspaper, "My name is Emily. I lost my voice because of my stepmother. She wanted to kill me." After some more thought, Emily added, "I'm starving." Taking the newspaper, the girl went outside. Both the man and the animal looked back at the creaking door. "Well, what have you got there?" The man looked at the paper, read it, and whistled in surprise. "Wolfie, look at that. There's a whole thriller here. You're not making it up?" This was now referring to Emily. She shook her head. "Well, Wolfie, should we believe it?" The man turned to the animal. The animal made a short sound, as if confirming. "All right. First, we need to feed her and give her a bath," said the man. As if remembering something, he added, "Why weren't you scared of Wolfie? You thought he was a dog, right?" Emily nodded again. "But he is a wolf," the man said with a snort. "I rescued him from a trap when he was a wolf cub. So now we live like 2 lonely wolves. My name is Hugh, and I'm a kind of forester." Emily nodded her head. "Okay, we've met." Hugh added food to Wolfie's bowl and nodded to Emily. "Come on, I'll feed you what God sent. The chowder is still warm, probably." The pleased girl followed him into the hut. Hugh took out a pot, poured the stew into 2 large bowls, and put a spoon and a couple of slices of bread. "Eat," he pointed to Emily's bowl. "Don't be afraid. There's hare meat in there. We don't eat girls. They give me an ulcer," he said, apparently pleased with his own joke. Emily, hesitating, smiled too and grasped the spoon. The stew turned out to be mind-bogglingly delicious. Or was it that she was so hungry and scared that she could eat a whole pot? Eating the stew with bread, she glanced stealthily at Hugh's face. "And he's not so old," she thought, "not like an elderly man. Just the beard adds age. Perhaps he's the same age as my father." Tears came to her eyes as she thought of her father, and she sobbed. "Hey, don't make everything wet in here." The owner of the hut raised his voice. "I can't stand these feminine tears." Emily, frightened by his displeasure, began eating silently again. The tears dried on their own. "What kind of scoundrel raises a hand against a child?" Hugh pondered. "And why didn't Daddy intervene?" Emily looked up at him and sighed. Then she shook her head and crossed her arms over her chest. "What? No mummy or daddy?" The woodsman was horrified. "Oh, you poor thing. I could have had a daughter your age if only—" He waved his hand and began to eat. Emily finished every last drop, wiped her plate with a crust of bread, and looked questioningly at Hugh. "What's next?" He understood correctly. "You're going to wash yourself now. The basin is outside and there's hot water in the buckets. I'll bring everything out. Just be careful." Emily rolled up the sleeve of her shirt, and Hugh saw the burn mark. "Who did that to you?" Hugh gasped. "Could it be your stepmother?" Emily nodded. Hugh's face darkened. He muttered something under his breath. Emily only understood one sentence. "We'll figure it out." "Go and wash yourself. Wolfie will look after you," the woodsman ordered. Having received a bucket of hot water, a towel, soap, and huge shorts, on which the forester had pulled the elastic band, so that at least in the waist they did not fall down, Emily went to wash. Behind the house there was a basin and a tub of rainwater. She washed away not only the dirt, but also the fears and tensions of the past years. Wolfie's face peeked out from behind the house, and it seemed to her that the wolf was smiling. With an independent demeanour, he approached and lay down, guarding her. Emily rubbed her body with renewed effort, then dried herself, dressed, and sat down next to her guardian. She affectionately stroked his dry fur and mumbled something in gratitude. Now that she had eaten and washed, she felt safer than she had in her former home. "Are you okay? Finished with the water treatments?" Hugh asked from around the corner. Instead of Emily answering, Wolfie raised his head and growled in affirmation. The forester, satisfied that his uninvited guest was dressed and even managed to wash her clothes from the wet pile, hung it up to dry, hummed, and sat down a little further away. "What am I to do with you, eh?" he asked, not so much to Emily as to himself. "Do you have any relatives?" The girl shook her head negatively. "That's bad," the man reflected. "Ideally, I should return you to the city and sue your stepmother." Emily looked at him with frightened eyes. "But I don't believe in our supposedly fairest justice system in the world." Hugh shrugged his shoulders. "Besides, while they sort things out, you'll be put in an orphanage. I bet it's not a good place." Emily waited anxiously for a decision. "There's also no sense in you staying with me," continued Hugh. "I'm not good for a young lady to live with. An old hermit. It's not right. And I'm used to being alone." Emily's lips trembled. It seemed to her that now Hugh would suggest that the orphanage would be the best solution for her. "Oh, please stop. We agreed not to breed dampness." The forester frowned, and Wolfie looked at her reproachfully. "I said I'll think of something." He clearly didn't know how to handle Emily. Wolfie, having settled down on the grass, watched, with obvious irony, as his master, having sent the girl to the hut, walked in circles, grumbling to himself under his nose something. "I can't kick her out. I can't go anywhere," Hugh reasoned, turning to Wolfie. "I can't turn her in to the police. Staying here isn't an option for her either, and I'm not a babysitter." "There's only one thing left," he said, shining with determination. "I'll take her to Teresa. She's a sorceress. Maybe she'll help her get her voice back. And don't look at me like that," he said to Wolfie, though he remained silent. "I know that her character is not sugar, but at least she's a woman." Wolfie raised one ear and covered his nose with his paw, seemingly laughing. "Go ahead and giggle at me," Hugh threatened him with his finger. "By the way, this is your responsibility. You're the one who brought the girl from the swamp here." Wolfie looked at him reproachfully as if saying, "Would you have left the child there?" "All right. Don't squint. So, we decided to go to Teresa's." Emily was sitting on the bench, looking at the interior decoration of the hut. But what kind of decoration was there? A furnace, A bench, a table, a chest, a window without a curtain. On the walls hung brooms of different herbs, and various tools needed in the household. That's all. It was obvious that the owner lived alone, and here she had fallen on his head. He'll kick me out or give me back to my stepmother, Emily sadly thought. These thoughts made her feel chilly, and she wrapped herself more tightly in her shirt. For some reason, she was no longer afraid of this wild-looking man. She felt that men like him would never hurt. That's what her daddy was like. Courageous, strong, kind. Emily dropped her face on her hands folded on the table and burst into tears. The girl did not hear how Hugh came into the room and sat down next to her. He gently stroked her back with his broad palm. Don't cry, baby. Life is such that you can't even cry enough. Emily listened quietly as the forester spoke. Do you like fairy tales? He asked, and she saw a smile on his face. Emily lifted her head and nodded. Then you must know some fairy tales about witches. Emily opened her eyes even wider, but nodded again. I have an acquaintance who lives nearby, in a village. She is the only one left in that village, Hugh continued. Her name is Teresa. She is a skilled healer, and people come to her from miles away. She is a very moral person. She can cure anyone for free, but she can refuse to cure anyone for a large sum of money. I'm sure she can cure your inability to speak. Emily listened attentively, feeling like she was in a fairy tale. However, she was afraid to go to a strange woman, in case she turned out to be angry like her stepmother, and besides she was starting to get used to Hugh. We will go and visit her, Hugh continued. She cured me as well, when I thought I would never recover. Now I help her in any way I can. I fix things in her house and gather firewood. Believe me, Emily, there is a chance that you will be able to speak again. Emily nodded uncertainly. That's settled, Hugh rejoiced. You can sit here and solve this crossword puzzle while I gather some gifts for Teresa. It's not appropriate to go empty-handed when asking for help. He left the room, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. Emily couldn't sit still. The future frightened her. She looked around and found a broom and began to sweep the floor. Then she wiped the window with a rag and dusted it. Unable to think of anything else to do, she lay down on the bench and fell asleep. Were you tired? Hugh's voice woke her up. Emily opened her eyes and smiled shyly. He didn't seem as scary to her anymore. Her stepmother, despite her false kindness, turned out to be a real witch, and this big man living in the forest with a tame wolf didn't harm her. He fed her and even promised to help her heal. I'm impressed at how tidy everything here is. Hugh looked around. Thank you. Sorry, but I can't just leave you here. It's not right. And what kind of caretaker would I be? Worthless. Emily nodded shyly. He was saying the right things, but the girl had already experienced enough fear, and she wasn't sure what to expect next. Don't worry, Hugh encouraged her. If you are rested, it's time to hit the road. Here, take this bundle of presents. Hugh handed her a wicker tub of berries. Teresa has a sweet temperament and likes to be appeased. It will help. In his backpack, he packed all sorts of things, apparently also as a gift for the strange Teresa. Then he took Emily by the hand, and together with Wolfie, they moved along the path. Emily was looking around curiously. Now, with Hugh walking beside her, tall and strong, and the faithful Wolfie trotting nearby, life didn't seem so hopeless to her. However, when the forest suddenly ended and they reached a row of dilapidated houses, the girl became scared and held onto his broad palm tighter and tighter. You promised to be brave, didn't you? Hugh smiled encouragingly at her, and Emily, sighing, straightened up and tried to stop trembling. Teresa lived in the outermost hut, the one closest to the forest. However, as they later discovered, it was the only inhabited house. The rest of the houses were empty, left behind by their owners, who had either moved away or passed away, lying here in the cemetery. The village, and the only woman who lived in it, would have been forgotten if it hadn't been for the fame of the healer, which spread many kilometres around. "Teresa, open up!" Hugh shouted while knocking on the door. Emily tried to hide behind Hugh's broad back. Meanwhile, the door creaked, and Teresa emerged into the light. At least, that's how Emily imagined her, in a long skirt and a shawl. Her head was covered with a scarf, despite the summer. Emily felt a chill and started to twist her palm, but Hugh held her firmly. "Is it you, Hugh?" the elderly woman asked. "It's me. Who else?" the man confirmed. "And who's with you?" Teresa put her palm, folded visor, to her forehead. It seemed to the girl that the strange woman could see through her now. "Well, I found her in the woods," Hugh shrugged. "She can't speak. She only writes that her stepmother left her in the woods." "She's not lying," Teresa declared. "I can smell a lie a mile away, and that little girl was really hurt. What do you want from me?" "Heal the girl," Hugh requested, placing Emily, who was stubborn, in front of him. "She's not naturally mute, just afraid. Can you help?" "Maybe I can." Teresa kept her gaze on the pale girl. "Only it's difficult to overcome fear. She's still afraid, even of me, aren't you?" She turned to Emily. After a moment's thought, Emily nodded. "You see," Teresa shrugged, "it won't work. Let the doctors treat her. We should send the child to town, to a good hospital." "We can't send her to town," said Hugh. "Either they'll put her in an orphanage, or she'll be returned to her stepmother. That's most likely, and she could destroy her altogether." "And maybe they won't." Teresa squinted. "If the proper authorities keep an eye on her. You have an acquaintance there, don't you?" Emily felt Hugh, behind her, freeze immediately. "We're not going to talk about that," he said quietly, but in a way that made the grandmother's desire to sneer disappear. "Are you going to treat the girl, or shall I take her back to the forest?" The elderly woman remained silent, chewing her lips. "You're a fool, Hugh, but it's your business, and I won't interfere. All right, I'll see what I can do. Leave the girl." Emily shuddered, but Hugh let out a relieved sigh. "Thank you, Teresa. God give you good health," he said sincerely. "I've brought some forest guests here. Indulge yourself." Teresa's eyes twinkled, but her expression remained stern. "Unload the presents on the porch," she commanded. "And you, my dear, come to me," she said to the girl in a suddenly affectionate tone. "Come, come, I won't eat children. My teeth aren't the same now." It seemed to Emily that the elderly woman winked, although it was difficult to tell from such a distance. Hugh nudged the girl towards the porch and followed Teresa into the house. The girl hesitated, standing near the porch. "Why don't I run back to the woods?" A stray thought flashed through her mind, and then she felt Wolfie nudge her nose, as if urging her to comply. Emily turned around and looked at the wild creature. It was whimpering, trying to wag its tail, and seemed to be smiling. Emily took a deep breath, climbed the creaky steps to the porch, and went inside. Inside was interesting. She couldn't find another word for it, as her eyes darted around. And there was so much to see, because in this house the most incredible things coexisted. For example, iron on coals, and a laptop, bundles of herbs on the walls, and various flasks, like the ones Emily had seen in chemistry classes. Seeing the girl's face filled with surprise, Hugh and Teresa laughed. "That's how I am, a modern witch," proclaimed the elderly woman, proudly surveying the laboratory. "Don't be surprised that I live in the forest. I choose to live far away from the hustle and bustle, closer to nature." "Teresa got her doctoral thesis on herbs," Hugh added. "People come to her from all over the country for advice and treatment. And she even got me back on my feet." "You're on your feet, but your brains are still not in order," grumbled Teresa. Hugh tried to say something, but she cut him off. "And since you don't want to listen to anything, let's keep the conversation short. Leave the girl and go on your way. We'll figure it out without you." Hugh laughed again, winked at Emily and said, "Look how stubborn she is." Crouching beside the girl, he wiped away her involuntary tears and said, "Don't be afraid of anything. Teresa won't harm you. We'll come to visit soon, and you'll see. You'll start talking by then." And yet the girl was afraid to be alone with Teresa. Meanwhile, the elderly woman scrutinized her carefully, then came up and unexpectedly hugged her tightly by the shoulders. "I see that life has taken away your faith in people. Hugh was like that when I met him, here in the woods. He came here to die. That's how it was. I healed his body, but I couldn't heal his soul. I look at you and wonder if it's a problem for you," Teresa said. Emily looked at the old woman incomprehensibly. "Well, let's have tea. We can also eat berries. Do you like berries?" Teresa asked. Emily nodded. "Good. Then get some cups from the locker over there," Teresa instructed. Emily reached over, opened the door and gasped. There stood a whole set of indescribable beauty, made of the finest and most transparent porcelain. Bring it, it's for using, not admiring," encouraged Teresa. And still Emily took the cups carefully, using only 2 fingers, afraid of damaging such a miracle. But the tea from those cups was 100 times tastier. It was with crushed berries, smelling like summer brewed in a kettle, and with each sip the girl breathed easier, and her fears and anxieties went away. Emily raised her eyes to the elderly woman, sitting opposite and smiling. "Well, how is the tea? Magical, isn't it?" Emily nodded and smiled back, although not bravely. "Do you know about living water?" Teresa continued the conversation. "Well, everything here is alive, but it doesn't help everyone, only the good and kind, and those who are ready to be healed. Are you ready?" Emily nodded again. She really liked this fairy tale woman, even though she had seemed like an angry witch at first. "That's good," approved Teresa. "Now we'll finish our tea, clean up the dishes, and then we'll go to drive away your ailments." Emily looked wary. She wondered how they were going to drive her sickness away. However, after thinking about it, she decided not to be afraid. It couldn't be worse than at her stepmother's, that was for sure. After clearing the table and washing the dishes in a large basin, they set off along the path through the field. Emily walked beside Teresa, admiring the grass and flowers. Under the approving gaze of the elderly woman, she wove herself a luxurious wreath and placed it on her head. "Beautiful," appreciated Teresa, and Emily felt quite cheerful. And maybe everything really would be fine, like in a fairy tale. Now she really wanted to believe it. The path led to a river, which banks were overgrown with lilies. Clouds floated in the water, and the girl involuntarily looked at them, feeling light and free. Teresa was the first to take off her blouse and skirt, revealing a simple nightgown made of plain material. She straightened her back and suddenly seemed less ancient to the girl. Emily, embarrassed, also undressed and touched the water with her toes. "It's cold. Brr. Be brave, my girl, otherwise the water won't take away your illness," sternly said Teresa from behind. Emily took a step, another, and suddenly went under the water almost completely. She opened her mouth to scream, but only a wheeze came out of her throat. Teresa, standing a step away, took a handful of water and poured it on the girl, muttering something under her breath. And then the fear suddenly disappeared. Emily's breathing evened out, and she felt the bottom under her feet. All she had to do was take a step, it turns out. "Try saying something," Teresa demanded. "Sing!" "Ah," the girl managed to utter, to sing. Her voice wouldn't obey, but now she knew for sure she would definitely speak again. "Good girl," praised Teresa. "The river has accepted you, agreed to help you. We'll come here every day, and everything will work out." Emily nodded. She didn't want to get out of the water herself now, and splashed around near the bank. "Here," Teresa tossed her a wreath. "Give it to the river as a thank you for the cure." Emily stroked the flowers and carefully pushed the wreath into the current. The river picked up the gift and gently carried it away along with the clouds. The girl watched it go and smiled. She felt so good now, and the world, which wasn't only evil and cruel, was shining with new colours. On the bank, however, it turned out that her skin was covered with large goosebumps, and she clenched her teeth while the caring woman rubbed her with a big terry towel. It was more fun to go back along the same path. Emily ran ahead, plucked blades of grass, and generally behaved like an unruly puppy. Teresa smiled at her and looked younger herself. Once inside the cabin, Emily suddenly felt hungry. She glanced at Teresa, who was serenely reading on the sofa. The girl mumbled, trying to get her attention. However, the woman either didn't hear or was too engrossed in her reading to turn her head. Emily approached closer, patted her belly, and made a mooing sound a few more times. "Don't moo, speak with words." Without lifting her head, Teresa scolded her. Emily felt indignant in her mind, thinking, "How can I speak with words? I can't." "So, it's not much of your need," the grandmother calmly responded, noticing her confusion. Emily tensed up. Sounds were bubbling in her throat, but they refused to come out. She imagined them as billiard balls. All she had to do was hit each one with an invisible cue and make them roll down her throat. Mentally, she picked up 3 balls and pushed. Unexpectedly, the sounds escaped her. Teresa interrupted her reading and stroked Emily's head. "Well done," she praised. "Everything will work out for us. We just need to try. And now we'll eat. Take a bowl, go to the backyard. I have chickens there. Collect the eggs. We'll fry them. Oh, how delicious it will be." Still not fully recovered from the shock, Emily went to the yard. There were indeed motley chickens and a brightly coloured rooster wandering around. Under his disapproving crowing, the girl collected 5 eggs from the straw and returned home with a triumphant look. "Well done," Teresa smiled, and soon the hut was filled with the delightful aroma of fried eggs. It turned out to be incredibly delicious. Emily picked up the last crust from the plate and closed her eyes like a satisfied kitten. However, Teresa did not share the same joyful mood. It was as if she was listening to something inside her. Then she went to the door, opened it, and barely had time to step back before Wolfie burst into the house. The wolf, whimpering, rushed around the hut, looking back at the door as if calling someone. And Emily noticed with horror the blood on his fur. "Something has happened to Hugh," Teresa shouted. "He must have run into poachers. Stay here. I'll call for help. I told you to wait here." But Emily could no longer hear the elderly woman's shouts behind her. She followed Wolfie out of the house, and they raced along the same road on which Hugh had brought her here. Wolfie constantly looked back to check if she was following him. The girl was running, her heart beating as if it were going to jump out of her chest. Wolfie jumped out into the clearing and howled. The girl shuddered when she saw a man lying in the grass. She rushed over to him, squatted down, and tried to turn him over. For a moment, it seemed like Hugh wasn't breathing, His camouflage pants were soaked with blood. Emily got dirty, but she continued to shake him, hoping he was still alive. Wolfie whimpered next to her, nudging his muzzle against his friend. And when Emily finally despaired of bringing Hugh back to life, a hoarse "Daddy" came out of her throat. And the first miracle was followed by the second. Hugh groaned and turned over, looking at the girl in amazement. "Emily, is that you? Why are you here?" he asked with difficulty. "Daddy!" sobbed Emily, looking at the bloody grass. Hugh tried to sit up but couldn't and wrinkled his nose. "I tried to get those local poachers who have long been tormenting the forest dwellers, but they shot both of my legs." Hugh tried to move his legs, but nothing happened. "Emily, I have a knife in my bag on my belt. Try to cut the jacket and bandage them." The girl composed herself, tears drying up on their own. Hugh helped her open the folding knife, and Emily began to work. The strong material didn't want to give in, but she managed, and she was horrified when she saw what had happened to Hugh's legs below the knees. She looked up at him with widened eyes, conveying that the situation was bad. "Don't lose hope, darling. We've gotten out of troubles like this before," he encouraged either Emily or himself. "Cut the cloth into long strips and tie them as tightly as possible," he requested. "I'll try to crawl. In these woods there are not only wolves wandering about, but other dangerous beasts as well, including two-legged ones." Following the wounded man's advice, Emily tightly bandaged his legs to stop the bleeding, bringing relief to both of them. With Emily's help, Hugh turned over onto his stomach and attempted to crawl. It was slow progress, but it was working. They took breaks when Hugh grew tired, and Emily wiped the sweat from his forehead. Wolfie licked Hugh's pale face with its long tongue and whimpered. "We'll make it, I know we will," Hugh whispered with determination as he continued to crawl persistently. Several hours seemed to pass. Emily did not know how many. Time lost all meaning, and then Hugh's strength left him, and he lost consciousness. Emily jumped to her feet, ran frantically around the clearing, and then a dam burst in her throat, and all over the forest there was a resounding "Help!" She screamed and begged for a miracle. And then the miracle happened. The forest was filled with the crackling of branches. A tall woman rushed into the clearing, rushed to Hugh, sat down next to him, hurriedly opened the first aid kit. After her, a huge grey-haired man came in the same camouflage suit as Hugh's, jumped out of the bushes. "Chuck, we need to get him inside the house as soon as possible," the woman ordered, glancing back at Emily. She asked, "Run to the house and boil water, lots of it. Do you remember the way?" Wolfie appeared nearby, and Emily followed him, trusting that the giant man would carry Hugh in his arms. Teresa emerged from the forest hut to meet them. How did the car manage to get here? Emily wondered, noticing the SUV parked behind the hut. Can this strange elderly woman still drive? They quickly boiled water and prepared bandages and cotton. When the door opened, a moaning Hugh was brought into the house by the hulking Chuck, who seemed to fold almost in half. The woman followed closely behind, revealing her stunning beauty. She was simply breathtaking. Hugh was laid on the table, and both women busily attended to him. "Let's not interfere." Chuck's large hand rested on the girl's shoulder. Obeying him, Emily went out into the courtyard and finally let her tears flow. She sobbed, uttering incoherent syllables, while Chuck silently comforted her, saying, "Don't be afraid of Hugh, daughter. He has overcome many challenges before. He saved my life twice, and not just mine. Now it's time to equal the score. We will catch those bandits and punish them, have no doubt." Gradually, Emily calmed down, her trembling shoulders growing still. Teresa came out of the house, embraced the girl, and spoke lovingly. "You're mistaken, Chuck. It wasn't us. It was she who saved his life today. and I had told Hugh back then that he would have a daughter, and it turned out to be true." "Has he regained consciousness?" Chuck inquired. Emily sensed that there was something they weren't telling her. "Are you asking about Nina?" Teresa chuckled. "She hasn't left his side, standing guard while he sleeps. They will finally have a chance to talk." "Hugh's stubborn." Chuck shook his head. "He still hasn't forgiven Nina after all these years." "What a fool he is," Teresa calmly replied. "His mother didn't want to share her son with his bride. She told Hugh that Nina got rid of his unborn child, and he believed it. He never returned home, signed a contract, and after that she had a miscarriage. It wasn't her fault. I know that for a fact." "And if he hadn't signed, I wouldn't have been rescued by him," Chuck sighed. "That's just how it happened. It's like fate." "Fate?" Teresa agreed, her eyes suddenly shining brightly. "Did also fate compel you to rush to your friend's aid at the first call?" "It seems so," Chuck nodded. "I was on a training exercise, and I flew the helicopter up here." He laughed, causing Emily to shudder. "You'll come back and fly from your post for self-rule," said Teresa sarcastically. Chuck simply raised an eyebrow and stretched, saying, "Well, I wouldn't be so sure. Where will they find another specialist of my caliber?" "And Nina arrived here to save him immediately," Teresa mused. "Hugh got lucky to have both of you." "Lucky," Chuck agreed, glancing at Teresa. "Do you think I'll ever be lucky?" "There you go again." The woman waved her hands. "Chuck, I'm already old. You're only 6 years younger than me. You're a handsome man. You should find someone younger." "Oh, Teresa, I don't need someone young." Chuck shook his grey beard. "I need someone I love." "Why did we start talking about this in front of the child?" Teresa sighed, and Emily was astonished to see the youthful sparkle in her eyes. The door opened and a pale Nina stepped towards them. "Is he awake?" Teresa asked, gazing into her face. "Yes," said Nina with a trembling voice. "Kicked me out," and she covered her face with her hands. "All right." Teresa stood up resolutely, pushing Chuck to move. "Look after the girls here, and I'll go and talk some sense into this stubborn fool. I don't care if he's wounded." Chuck hugged the crying Nina. Emily, after a moment of thought, embraced her from behind and pressed against her, comforting the distressed woman. "Now, be silent and listen," resounded from the hut, making everyone shudder. "We didn't bring you back from the other world just so you could hurt yourself and Nina again." They did not hear what Hugh replied, but something clearly broke in the house. Then only incoherent muttering could be heard. After another half an hour, Teresa, obviously pleased with herself, came back out. "Nina, go into the house. You need to talk," she ordered in a tone that brooked no objection. Nina, looking helplessly at Emily, went into the house, and Teresa took her place and winked at the girl. "Don't worry, they'll figure it out. They have even more in common now than before. They'll definitely come to an agreement." While Chuck chopped wood behind the forest house to calm his nerves and find a purpose for himself, the elderly woman and the girl sat huddled together and waited for something. Then Teresa nodded. "That's it. We can go in." She walked first and froze in the doorway, blocking it with her body. Then she coughed and remarked caustically, "You'll have plenty of time for more conversations. You have your whole life ahead of you. And now, the tea will be just right." Nina, who had been agitated, distanced herself from Hugh, and busied herself with setting on the table. There was nothing to remind them that it had recently been turned into a makeshift operating table. Hugh lay quietly and extremely thoughtful, but followed Nina with eyes full of tenderness. When Emily drank her tea, she noticed that Hugh's hand was gently stroking Nina's hand. "First aid has been provided. Now we must go to the hospital," Teresa said in a tone that brooked no objections. "I think they can manage without us now, especially since we have to decide about the girl." "It's already decided." Hugh looked at Emily and smiled. You called me Daddy in the forest, didn't you? So I think you won't leave me, helpless and wounded." Emily shook her head and said with some difficulty, "No." Teresa looked at Nina and grinned. "Well, Nina, I suppose you'll have to use your official position once in your life. You're the children's ombudsman, right?" Nina nodded and looked at Hugh with a slight challenge. "Yes, and I know exactly how to punish those who harm children." "That's how we'll decide." Teresa took the initiative in her hands, seemingly accustomed to being in command. "Nina, let's put our wounded man in your jeep. You take the girl and decide with her guardian. And if she doesn't understand words, the guys and I will join in," chuckled Chuck, squinting at the commanding Teresa. "I don't think we'll need to, but thanks for the offer," Nina said. "Well, let's pack up. We still have to go to the hospital," Teresa continued. "Chuck, you can go back. They'll definitely catch you. They'll send troops to find their heroic colonel." "No need for troops," said Chuck, considering. "However, I have one more unfinished business here." And he looked meaningfully at Teresa. "Don't even think about it." She waved her hands. "What kind of avenger are you? This is a matter for the police. Stay out of it." Be quiet, woman," said Chuck, furrowing his thick eyebrows. "They have offended my friend, so they have offended me. Do you think I'm going to run to the police to complain? I said I'll take care of it myself." Surprisingly, Teresa remained silent. "We really should go." Nina looked at Emily and asked, "You're coming with us, aren't you?" The girl nodded, gathered her courage, and said, "Yes." "I told you that the treatment would help," Hugh smiled. "And you, don't be brave," Teresa said strictly. "You should recover first until the wedding." "Until theirs or ours," Chuck interjected, and Emily was amazed to see that the formidable witch could blush. She realized that the adults needed to pack, but she only had what she was wearing, so she hugged the wolf tightly. The wolf licked her face with its rough tongue, as if it knew they were going to be separated. "Wolfie," the girl said, struggling to speak. And then they were rushing first along the country road, then along the highway, and Hugh's head was lying in Emily's lap, and she was stroking his hair, begging someone up there. "You're the strongest, the smartest. You already have my own daddy and mummy. Leave Hugh with me. Don't take him away. I'll be very, very obedient. I'll help him and Nina with everything. Just make sure he gets better." It seemed that the child's prayer was answered. During his time in the hospital, Chuck took care of him, being there for his friend. Emily lived at Nina's place, and the latter took care of her case, sparing the girl's psyche so much that she didn't even have to meet her hated stepmother. Emily heard that stepmother's young husband had left her. When she returned without Emily and with an unclear explanation of what had happened, he filed for divorce. Perhaps some remnants of conscience remained. In contrast, Annabelle denied everything until she was shown the video with Emily's story. Nina wanted to make the punishment as severe as possible, but there was no direct evidence of an attempt on the child's life. However, the law hit the cruel woman where it hurt the most, her pocket, imposing a hefty fine. Custody was out of the question from now on, so Nina proposed her own candidacy for adoption. Her request was granted. When Hugh was discharged from the hospital, he and Nina filed the necessary documents at the registry office. By then, Emily, being a smart girl, had already understood from conversations with Hugh and Nina, had always loved each other, but were separated by the intervention of Hugh's mother. Life itself severely punished her for that. When Hugh, shocked by the perceived betrayal of his beloved, decided to join the military, his mother lost her peace and became very ill. At that time, Teresa, younger but no less sharp, tried to help her regain her strength, and the truth eventually came out. But it was too late. The mother passed away without seeing her son again or finding redemption for her sins. Only now, after many years, did everything fall into place. One day, Nina, Hugh and Emily visited the graves of the girls' parents. "I love you," whispered Emily, carefully placing flowers on the ground. "And I always will. Don't worry, now I have Hugh and Nina with me. Will you be mad if I call them Mum and Dad too? And I also have Grandma Teresa and Grandpa Chuck. They got married too, but they had an argument at first. Grandpa asked her to live with him, but she refused to leave the forest, so he moved in with her, and now he sometimes goes to work by helicopter. Don't miss me. I'll come to visit you often and tell you everything. Oh, you don't know. I used to be completely mute, but now everything is fine." Emily looked up and smiled at the sun, the sky, and the clouds. She had always believed in good fairy tales, and now she realized that her own personal fairy tale had a good beginning after all.